Hello everyone, and welcome to my new podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts on Sustainability. I have guests from all over the world and we'll be talking about their thoughts on sustainability and how they do their part to make the world a greener place.
Good morning,
Hello.
How are you?
Good. I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good.
Excellent. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me this morning for you, this evening for me. How was your trip? Because you was over in Vermont, I think, last week.
I was in Vermont, yes, last week. It was really good. I think there's quite a lot of interest in the potential for the state there having a Future Generations Act, which would be really good. So if we could get them as the first US state, that potentially quite
a good start. Yes, Very good. So is that part of your role then, to try and establish what you're doing for Wales elsewhere in the world as well?
That's what I'm doing at the moment, yes.
Yeah.
Amongst a few other bits.
Many other things.
Yeah. But that's I suppose that's my passion, really. Yeah.
Try and get us all to think about the future rather than the past.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes.
Not easy.
No, definitely not. No. Thank you, Sophie, for making the time to talk to me today. I'm really looking forward to discussing the issues around sustainability and what that means for our future generations and what we can do to make sure we do actually have a future. It's really good of you to take the time. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief précis of your role that you're doing for Wales at the moment and the wider implications of what you're trying to achieve, and then we'll go on from there.
So for the last 7 years until January of this year, I was the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and I'm imagining your listeners are thinking, what on earth is that? And that's not surprising, because I was the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. And essentially, my role came about through passing of a law in Wales in 2015, which was called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and it does a number of things. I suppose most significantly, it places this duty on all of our public institutions, so all our local government institutions, our health institutions, national organisations like our Environment Agency, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how, when they're taking decisions, they're meeting today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals for Wales, which all of those organisations have duties to take steps to meet. And it establishes the role of an independent Future Generations Commissioner. So my job, as set out in law, was to be the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. What that meant in practice was, I suppose, holding government and others to account on how they were actually meeting the obligations in the legislation. And my term of office came to an end in January. There's a new commissioner now, but what we've been doing in Wales has gained quite a lot of international interest, and so I'm now working with a range of different countries at different levels of government across the world who are interested in perhaps doing something similar.
Sounds like a quite a challenging role, I would say.
Yes. I've still got some of the scars on my back.
I'm sure you have. I think there's a lot of reluctance to change, unfortunately, in the establishment globally. And I think that's one of the key things that's driving the situation we're in now, to be honest. When you look at the climate issues we're having all over the place right now, I mean, especially across Europe this summer, the temperature rises were horrendous. I was actually talking to a colleague who's from Poland, and he's saying that Poland is now planning to have summer holidays in northern Poland for people from southern Europe, because the temperatures, they're expecting the temperatures to be so excessive that they would want to get out of where they are, south of France and Italy and places like that, and go to somewhere slightly cooler, which, when you think about that, it's really frightening that we've got to this point.
Yeah, and we're still not doing enough to get anywhere near addressing the scale of that emergency, even when places are literally burning in front of us. There is the problem with how our political system works.
It doesn't work, yes. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I see as being a stumbling block there, and I don't know whether you do as well, is the short-term view that most governments have, that they have a period of time that they're in power, and if what they want to do can't be achieved within that period of time, they won't try and do it. There's no altruism, really. They're not doing something for the benefit of everyone. They're trying to find things that will get them back into office.
Yes, I think that is certainly the case. The whole system is stacked up towards short-termism, and that's even more challenging in our electoral cycles here in the UK are 5 years. Of course, in Australia and New Zealand, 3 years. I was in Vermont last week, where their cycle is 2 years. How on earth anyone can get anything done, let alone anything kind of future focused done in that period of time is beyond me. But I suppose, there's also a responsibility on us, the public, citizens. Yes, absolutely. Our politicians must lead. And, you go into a role like that, and you should be going into it for the greater common good. But also, politicians are responsible and answerable to the public, and often the public can be quite short term as well, or we say we might want certain things, but then when that comes down to that impacting upon us individually, often we don't like it, and we've got some really live issues around that in Wales at the moment. So none of this is easy, which is why it's so important that there is some embedded legal infrastructure in our systems of governance, which doesn't necessarily transform things overnight, but starts to set a new context for ways in which we work, think, and our expectations on politicians and leaders.
Yeah. So making sure that the decisions we're making are legally required is probably the biggest lever we've got to control what governments do, I guess, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, have you seen in the 7 years that you've been in that role, have you seen any significant change in the way things are done?
Yes, I have. I mean, I certainly can't say that everything's perfect, because although this was a piece of legislation that has been passed, essentially this is a massive cultural change programme, the biggest cultural change programme probably any country has ever embarked on. This is about embedding in every aspect of our system requirements to consider future trends and scenarios, consider the long-term impact of your decisions, to seek to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. And we're very poor at that as well. We tend to just throw money at a problem after it's happened, rather than stopping it happening in the first place. To integrate our actions, so to do sort of joined up government. Again, government's really bad at joining the dots between things, collaboration and involving citizens. Those are the 5 principles in our law by which our institutions are required to operate. And some of the things that we've seen in terms of that transformational change, so massive shifts in transport policy, for example. We've more or less stopped building roads in Wales, because if you apply our 7 wellbeing goals, if you think about the carbon impact of building roads, if you think about the impacts, positive or negative, on people's health, on cohesive communities, on inequality, actually what we were doing, all of us have been doing for decades and decades, filling a road up, a road gets congested, what do? We build another road, or we widen that road, or what have you. It's actually a ridiculous idea. In the long term, that doesn't work, because 15 years later, sometimes even less, that road is just as full as it was before.
Just look at the M25. I mean, it's the worst road in the world, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. And we need to be giving people opportunities to, we need to be encouraging modal shift, which basically means how can we make public transport, active travel, a viable alternative? And there's lots of different ways that we can do that, but we have to stop doing certain things and start doing other better things. So this is not just about sort of trying to do the same old things better. This is about doing fundamentally better things in line with this vision for wellbeing that we have in Wales.
Yeah, I think one of the key issues there, I think, is making locations where you live also be locations where you can work, so you can walk to work rather than having to commute for an hour and a half. I mean, I know from my time in the UK, an hour and a half to 2 hours commute each way every day was part of the job in the southeast of England. It's a big change for me here in New Zealand. I've been here since 2010, and my commute to work is about 15 or 20 minutes, which is a massive change in terms of the amount of time I spend on the road, but also the impact that I have on the environment around me. And so I think that's one thing that I think that big metropolises are going to struggle with, is trying to change that sort of work-life transportation process. And I don't know what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, which is, what we're trying to roll out in Wales. That's not always, again, straightforward, because we're dealing with existing infrastructure and so on and so on. But the concept that, within a 20-minute walk, cycle, roller skate, if that's your thing, or public transport ride, you can access all of the key things you need. So, work, leisure, public services, your local shops and amenities and so on. And if we look back to what we have all done, particularly our town and city planners over many years, we've built everything around car use. We've not built things around, people walking and cycling and so on. And we need to unpick and change that. And some places have already done that. There's some really interesting case study in Utrecht in the Netherlands, where about sort of 20 or 30 years ago, they said, well, well, actually, we're so congested, we've got these high levels of air pollution, people are dying as a result, so on and so on. We're going to stop doing that and we're going to transform. And if if your listeners Google Utrecht before and after, you will see the difference in those car-clogged communities to somewhere where you think, actually, I'd really like to live here. Those things don't happen by accident. They happen by a range of purposeful policy interventions.
Civic planning has been,
that's within a framework. I can talk to, spent some time in Texas, which just blew my mind for a number of reasons. Number one, I was on an 8-lane freeway, as they call it there, because it started, I think, at 3 or 4 lanes. That had got full. They'd added another, and, lanes sort of from lane 5, you paid an extra amount of money to go on that because it was slightly faster and everything else was still congested. And lane 8, you paid an even bigger amount of money to travel on that. And then when you get to the city, the towns, I can remember being in a smallish town there where I'd gone to visit the mayor in the town hall, and literally almost within touching distance across the road was a shop that I wanted to go to. And the guy that I was with said, well, get in the car. And I was like, are you kidding me? It's like literally just there. You won't be able to get there. Well, I was like, this is ridiculous. So I stood on the pavement waiting to cross the road. And he was right. He had got in his car and driven to the other side of the street. And I was there another 5 or 10 minutes waiting to physically walk across the road. And this is the madness of some of the things that we as humans have created.
Yeah, we built our lives around something that's very, very convenient for us and very inconvenient for a lot of other people, I guess, haven't we, with the car?
Yeah, and particularly it's going to be more than inconvenient for our future generations who are going to be paying the price of, they're already paying the price of air pollution, but will be paying the price in terms of the effects of those carbon emissions.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that there's enough funding available for what you're trying to achieve? Is that something that's holding things back at this point?
Well, this is one of the interesting things. The Future Generations Act, when it came into force in Wales, came with no new money. As you can imagine, this is, there's a lot of pushback on this. How on earth are we possibly going to do all of these new things that are required and so on with no additional money? But actually, it turned out to be a better thing because when you've been around the public sector, perhaps as long as I have, what you come to realise is that we have a very bad case of what I describe as pilotitis. When there's new money for stuff, we'll do new stuff as a pilot. Often the pilots will work, but then when the new money stops, then we stop doing that thing. And actually what we need to do is to mainstream these new ways of working and these new approaches. So that meant that things probably started a bit more slowly than they might have done if there'd been a big injection of cash. But actually it means that they've been embedded in the system in a greater sense. That's not to say, of course, that in some areas we wouldn't like a big injection of cash and into our public transport system, which has been lacking investment over very many decades, in order now to get people to give people really viable alternatives. We'd love to have a big injection of cash into that. So some of the money that we were spending on roads is now going into public transport instead, but that's not enough to bring our public transport system up to something which is first class, and that sadly is just the reality of public policy and public financing.
There's a lot of things that need money and only a small bucket to get all the money from, I guess, isn't there? I mean, one of the things that I guess that I've seen as a big impact is I don't think it's properly understood the health impact of the policies that we have in place around transport and the fact that you've got, for example, in New Zealand, we've got poor quality housing that's damp and mouldy, and we have something like a $7 billion a year cost to deal with the breathing issues associated with living in a damp and mouldy house. That's just a sunk cost that isn't really considered as something that could be used to fund improving the housing, so you don't have that issue. And I think the same is true with air quality. If you invested the money that you save by improving the air quality in another sustainable or another more future focused idea, it's kind of self-funding.
Yeah,
to a large extent.
Right. Yeah, and this speaks to the problems with the system, doesn't it? Because the system system can't cope with investing in one area to reap benefits in another.
Yeah.
And that is where, what we're trying to do in Wales is to really get underneath the skin of the system and change the system in that way. And that's where, often people will ask me, if there was one thing that you could do, or what do you think is the most important thing to do for future generations? And I always answer that question with the boring governance point, which is we need to reform the system and the way that the system is governed and operates. Because what you see across the world is we're putting in place interventions. Sometimes we're throwing a huge amount of money at particular problems or challenges or so on. And we're coming along to, COP in Dubai, as it will be in a couple of weeks, where no doubt new financial commitments will be made, new promises will be made, and so on. But then people come back to, to their own countries, and the system within which they're operating is still rotten at its core. It's not joined up. It's not long term. So whatever those commitments you've made and those initiatives that you want to take forward, they're never really going to scale to that transformational impact. Because, if you think of the system as the soil, and the good things that are trying to grow from that soil are the different programs that we need to put in place to tackle some of these big issues, the soil is rotten. So we need to improve the quality of the soil so that good things can grow in a faster, better
I guess way. Put it in the my context from a buildings perspective. What I see as being a real stumbling block around building better buildings is the disconnect between the operating expenditure and the capital expenditure. And it's that you have one team of people dealing with the capital cost and another team of people dealing with the operating cost, and they both do not talk to one another. And even if you're in the same organisation in a district health board over here, it's the same pool of money. They don't see the investment in the reduction of operating cost as being a good thing, because they've got a capital budget they need to work within. And that short-term view, what's the capital cost, upfront cost, is why we've got all of the issues, or a lot of the issues that we've currently got, I think. And that you try and build the cheapest possible solution without thinking of what that impact is long-term and what the whole of life impact of that solution may be. And there's a lot of hysteresis around that blending to what some people have started to call TOTEX, so total expenditure rather than capital expenditure and operating expenditure.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lack of understanding about the impacts of investing in the future, which is really what you're talking about. Yeah,
you're absolutely right on that. And there's live issues in the UK at the moment on exactly that with rack concrete. Concrete that had a sort of 20 to around about 20-year kind of life expectancy, but obviously was the cheapest option, and came within the capital budget allocation, and so on and so on. And now our future generations, our kids in schools primarily, but it doesn't stop at schools. Many of them closed. Many of them haven't been in school since the beginning of the school year in September, and so on. So we do need to be thinking about those longer term implications, and we do need to be thinking about joining the dots. And even where we try to do good things, there's a programme in Wales called 21st Century Schools, where if you look on paper at what is required in terms of building a new school, it's really excellent. So requirements around solar panels, requirements around rainwater harvesting, all of these different things. The problem is nobody has actually worked then with the caretakers of the school to show them how any of those things work. So when they go wrong, the caretaker doesn't know how to deal with it. So you might have the rainwater harvesting, but actually it no longer works and nobody's dealing with that. And that's because that's another part of the system that we haven't joined up. So this is where I say, everything comes back to the quality of the system and how sensibly the system operates, and what are its requirements in terms of operation. What are the requirements in terms of the people that we employ within that system, and how we performance management, how we reward them, and so on. What are we actually asking them to do? And we've never really posed those questions in any significant way in terms of focusing that on how they might be thinking in a long-term and joined-up way.
How do you think we can change that?
Well, I think legislation, certainly helps that. One of the things that I've found in my time as commissioner is that what I recognised is that there were a lot of people in the system that I describe as frustrated champions. So these are people who work in the system. You described, perhaps you're one of these frustrated champions. You described a frustration there about the craziness of the kind of
pricing and capital
between, CapEx and OpEx, for example. But you see those people across the board. They might be the children's social worker who are seeing one generation of a family to the next coming into the social care system because we've never really got up front of the issues that we're dealing with. You might be the family doctor who was seeing preventable healthcare conditions, again, coming through the system because we've never focused on what are the things that are actually going to keep that person well and stop them getting that condition. And those people are frustrated because often they're trying to change things. They can see where the problem is. They're trying to get up front of the problem, but the system frustrates them in doing that. Now, when we legislated in Wales, that basically is saying to the whole system, you must change. Now, of course, as I said, a system doesn't, as complex as that, doesn't just change overnight. But for those frustrated champions, what they tell me is that the law enabled them to go and wave a piece of legislation at the people who say no. I call them the abominable no men, the people who are like, no, we can't spend the money in that way. No, we can't do that. Or unless I see a return on that investment in the next 2 years, I'm not interested, or so on. To actually go and say, well, you actually have a legal duty. And not only that there's a commissioner who's going to be policing whether you're doing that. So I worked a lot with these frustrated champions to try and break down some of those barriers, sometimes bang heads together in different organisations and so on and so on. So I think that there is a model there which is beginning to show some transformation in Wales 7 years on. I think it will probably be at least another 7 years, if not 10 years, before we see the real impact of that. But certainly it makes sense to me for every country in the world to have some sort of legislative requirements around doing what I would say is common sense long-term thinking and governance. Yeah,
we've kind of got some of that legislation when you look at the targets for net zero carbon and actual carbon zero, the 2050. But the trouble is that they're not actually brought down to the grassroots level in a way that makes sense. And I know certainly from what I'm seeing in New Zealand that we're so far off those targets, it's extremely unlikely we'll hit them. And I know that that we're a small country. It should be, in a small country with a relatively small population, it should be easy to implement, really, or relatively so, compared to a larger country like the UK with 60 odd million people, or the US with 300 odd million people. The scale should make it a little bit easier, but it doesn't seem to work. And I just wondered what your view on as to why that is. I mean, Wales is probably about the same population as New Zealand, I think, isn't it? About 5 million?
A bit smaller. We're about 3.3 million. So, not that far off. But I think the reasons for this is the lack of join up in a complex system. So if I give you one example at the moment, Rishi Sunak at a UK level just in the last week has stepped back on a number of climate commitments that previous UK governments given. So the rollout of electric vehicles, the changes to boilers and heating and so on in people's homes, heat pumps and the likes. Yeah. And the reason, in some way, I've got a fairly small amount of sympathy, but I have got a small amount of sympathy for where he's at, which is we haven't put the things in place to make those things viable. So, for example, we haven't invested in rolling out the EV charging infrastructure that we need in order to stop selling diesel cars. And for everyone to have an EV. We haven't focused on how our poorer people, our poorer communities, will struggle to own diesel or petrol cars. How on earth are they going to afford to buy electric vehicles? Yep. Likewise, in terms of the heating for homes, entirely sensible way forward. But over in another department in government, 15 years ago, or when we made that commitment, at the very least, we needed to have done some really heavy investing in the skills, developing the skills for people to fit, to repair, and so on, the heat pumps that we need to put in. But that hasn't happened. So we don't have enough people to do this. So this is where I'm saying all of these failures, really, or our inability to move in the way that we need to move to meet those climate targets and other issues that we need to address are all to do, in my mind, with a failed system, which is not joined up and doesn't think long term.
I think one of the issues we've got in New Zealand around the adoption of EVs in particular is the electrical infrastructure, that it isn't designed to take the additional load.
Exactly.
And that is very much a long-term fix, and it requires a lot of investment. And New Zealand, along with lots of other countries in the world, has had a very expensive few years dealing with the implications of a pandemic. The funding is not there to do that kind of thing. But the reality is we should have started a long time before 2020 in dealing with these issues around the infrastructure, because that for me is the core of the issue. When you're looking at good sustainable technologies, most of them rely on clean power supplies. That's how you're going to get your heat pumps installed. installed that are going to be greener than your gas boiler or whatever it may be. And the only way to do that is to make sure you're heavily investing in sustainable sources of power. So whether it's tidal power, whether it's wind power, whether it's solar photovoltaics, whatever it may be, that investment needs to have been going on for a long time if you're going to hit your targets. And it hasn't been. But, and that's where I think that the way out of the issue we're in, I think, is going to come from the private sector rather than the public sector. That there's levels of investment available from people like Elon Musk, and you may not like all of what Elon Musk does, but the stuff he's doing around battery technology and things like that, that's driving change across the industry, that's resulting in better quality batteries that last for longer and give you a longer range on your electric vehicles, which makes them as more viable alternative to petrol vehicles. And it's that kind of thing, I think, that is going to drive the change that we need. And it's going to, I genuinely think it needs to be a combination of private investment and public investment in order to get to where we need to get to. And I just wondered what your view on that was.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you've said there. I think that the public sector need the private sector, not just in terms of financing, but also in terms of the more innovative mindset, perhaps, that exists within the private sector. It kind of slightly frustrates me. Well, not slightly. It frustrates me a lot, really, that the public sector almost have this inability to gear ourselves up to do some of these things in the wider public interest. So, for example, tidal power, big issue in Wales at the moment. We've got some real opportunities around tidal power. Now, that is a natural resource by, us, the people, and all the governments on our behalf. And yet we are requiring, we haven't been able to get our act together enough for public investment in that, for profits to come back into the public purse. Instead, we're relying on private sector innovation, investment, and so on. And that, that is the reality, and that is better than not having it at all. But actually, we should have governments that have that real, innovative streak in them, or that, innovation in their DNA, and ways of looking at how they might be able to do these things for the wider public good. Now, we could talk on a whole other podcast series about the reasons why.
Absolutely.
That doesn't happen. And I've seen that, the range of reasons that I've seen for that throughout my career. But I suppose, to answer your question, yes, it will be necessary. I think that we need to be really astute, though, in terms of, how we're negotiating some of that.
How you manage it.
How we're not, how government is taking a role of sense checking some of those things. So I don't know if you've ever heard of something called the Three Horizons model of futures thinking, but this is basically looking at how do we try to protect against innovations actually taking us back to kind of business as usual, or having inadvertent negative consequences elsewhere. So, yes, EVs are going to have to be part of a decarbonisation of transport solution. And actually, though, if we wanted to improve health, make communities more kind of cohesive, and, bring people together and so on, and address inequity, putting all of our eggs in an EV basket is not the answer at all. A better investment is investing in public transport and designing policy and infrastructure and, towns and communities in a way that facilitates those kind of 20-minute neighbourhoods and so on. So sometimes we can be swept away with the kind of private sector finance and innovation and so on. It's the job of government, I think, to sense check that against wider policy aims, because that is not necessarily what the private sector will be doing. No,
I mean, unfortunately, the private sector is private because it wants to make a profit, and that is the focus. And the good stuff that happens is kind of not necessarily an unintended consequence, but certainly isn't the main driver behind a lot of the decisions the big corporations make.
No.
Okay. I mean, do you think? Because one of the things in the back of my mind is that I think that there's quite a lot of vested interests in the status quo, because there's a lot of money to be made from the status quo, and I wonder whether there's a way of addressing that trying to get that out into the open so that the general public, are aware of what those vested interests are really doing. And I'm thinking in particular people like the petrochem industry. I mean, there's massive amount of financial pressure and financial power there that I believe is slowing down a lot of the things we're trying to do, because they're going to be losing a lot of money. mean, is there a way of addressing that? I don't know. I mean, we're going to run out of oil at some point, and that will address the issue, but it's probably a little bit too late by then.
Yeah. Well, it's about, there's that saying, isn't there, that I sort of slightly hesitate saying this because I think it's more complex, but, we elect the people we deserve, or we get the people we deserve, right? So I think there's something around us, the public, really sort of sense checking who we're voting for, what their connections are, and so on. I think there's something around us requiring more of our leaders in terms of transparency, in terms of really calling them out when on the one hand they might be declaring a climate emergency, on the other hand they might be in the pockets of X, Y, and Z organisation, so on, and that can be quite a complex thing to do. I think more broadly, the thing that gives me a bit of optimism is quite a worldwide movement now towards what is described as the wellbeing economy. So this is, we've always been in a position where basically people and planet have worked for the economy. The answer to any question that might be posed is do the thing that makes the most money, regardless of what that means for the planet and what that means for people. And that is why we're on, the brink of planetary collapse, and we're seeing these absolutely huge and escalating, rates in terms of wealth inequality. Something like the 26 richest people in the world hold the same amount of wealth as the poorest half, 50% of the world, which is like how, as a society, we have ever allowed that to happen. I have no idea. Well, I've got some ideas, but
it's the almighty dollar, unfortunately.
Yes, exactly. So I think there is something there around that. Consistently now in polling and so on, people are saying they want a wellbeing economy. They want the economy to work for people and planet rather than the other way around, and they want those things kept in check. I'm also optimistic about how our younger generations are thinking about this, our Gen Z and so on. I have a few of the Gen Zs myself, and they do think in completely different ways. They are far more interested about the values of the organisations that they're working for. They are moving in ways. So here in the UK, there's been a big decline, for example, in young men even bothering to learn to drive because they don't necessarily want the hassle of all that. They want to be able to use good public transport and so on. There are some challenges with this, but a big increase in vegetarianism and veganism. The sharing economy is absolutely the norm now amongst our Gen Z. So, my kids still wear all the designer clothes, but they absolutely do not buy them new. They buy them on Vinted, they buy them on eBay and so on, and they're part of that circular economy. So I am quite hopeful in terms of, how some of that is going to drive change, because these are, the next generation of consumers, and I think they want to consume, a bigger set of values in
more
mind.
ethically. I think a lot more ethically. I see the same with my I've got three children. They're 20, 22 and 24, so they're not really children anymore. and they're very much more focused on their impact on the world around them than I was at their age, for sure. And I think that's the future that we're talking about, trying to save the planet for, really, isn't it? And now, one of the misnomers that people use all the time is that we're killing the planet, and I just that's not true. We are killing some of the species on the planet, but what's ultimately going to happen is the planet's going to shrug us off and start again, and it won't notice we're not there. We think we've got this power. We really haven't. All we're doing is shortening our own life expectancy.
Exactly.
A lot of the species that we've killed off may not come back exactly as they were, but other species will take their place, and the diversity will be back again. You just look at the videos you saw of the planet in the depths of the pandemic and how plants were taken over and animals were taken over within weeks. It's like all those apocalyptic movies you thought were a bit of fantasy. Actually, they're not. The planet's actually a lot more resilient than we think it is, and we need to learn that lesson very quickly. Otherwise we're not going to be here for much longer. And it is frustrating because I've worked in the building industry for 40 years now, and the conversations I'm having with you and the other people I'm talking to are conversations that were happening 40 years ago, and we still haven't learned what we need to do, even though we knew 40 years ago what we needed to do, and we're still not doing it. And it is I'm definitely frustrated by that, because we could have made so many fundamental changes by now that would have really changed our future.
Absolutely.
I don't know. So the funding side of things is obviously a big stumbling block in a lot of these initiatives. But do you think that there is a way of us trying to, I suppose, educate people that the cost of adoption is actually not really a cost? The cost of not adopting is the real cost, and that sort of idea that the whole of life thing is actually the real issue we need to address, and stop focusing on how much does it cost to upgrade our public transport system rather than how much does it save because of the health benefits and the environmental benefits and the energy benefits we're getting. And that sort of changing that conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on infrastructure, there's been enough, catastrophe really for us to realise that, actually we are now footing the bill of us not taking that long-term view on cost previously, whether that RAC, whether that's the effectiveness or, of buildings in terms of withstanding extreme weather events, whether that's our lack of investment in public transport and our problems with congestion and so on. So, but I think that can only ever really be driven through clear regulation. And I know, that our word can often be a dirty word, but I think it is necessary to drive this change. And I'm not sure generally people being left to mark their own homework ever works out particularly well.
No,
so, there has to be, obviously that has to be done sensibly. It has to be done, in discussion with the various industries and so on. But it does require, I think, some of that purposeful leadership at a political level, working with industry to really drive that change.
I mean, I think one of the things I saw in the UK from a legislative perspective was when we're starting to focus on things like having green buildings and getting good quality buildings built. The building code was changed, and it was legislated that government would only move into buildings that met a certain minimum criteria, and that drove change across the building sector. And it is that same kind of approach, isn't it? That if we make it so that government is leading the way in the things that need to be done, others will follow because they know they've got to try and keep up, otherwise they're going to get left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what's happened with our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it only applies to the public sector, but not the private sector in theory, but actually quite quickly the construction industry in particular were seeing the requirements of the Future Generations Act coming out through public sector contracts and tenders and so on. And actually some of them haven't liked that, but some of them have really risen to the challenge. So some really interesting stuff around the building of net zero schools, for example, in Wales, but not just doing that in a kind of very technical way, looking at how do we do that in a way which also promotes cohesive communities. Even some stuff where the construction companies were working with a social enterprise set up by pupils in the school who were running a catering company, sourcing local food, who were then supplying the construction workers with their lunch and so on site, and actually involving some of the children, young people in designing the school right from the outset. And of course, using that as a learning opportunity about, how are we going to build this in a way which is like net zero? How are you then learning new skills as a pupil in this school about that, and feeling that kind of investment in you being part of, quite literally almost building this school? So I think, the framing of regulation, is important. I think the public sector needs to take a lead on that. But I think, ultimately, we all work in different, private sector organisations, but we're all also humans. We're mums, we're dads, we're neighbours, we're part of communities and so on. And it's in our interest. I want to walk out into a community that is green. I want to be able to walk my daughter to school, as I did this morning, with air that's not polluted and not dangerous for her because of the traffic and so on. I like it when I stop and have a chat with my neighbours. Those things are all about almost like the human condition, the things that we kind of like. So I think sometimes if we put our human hat on as well and say, how would I like to live in this community that I'm building, or how would I like this school to be working, there's something there as well that I think we can bring to the party.
Yeah, I think that taking personal responsibility is a big part of it, isn't it? And I think we spent too long blaming somebody else. It's not us. It's the big corporations. It's not us. It's the government. It's not us. I think that we've got to a point now, unfortunately, where that's no longer the way to look at things. Like you say, we've got to take responsibility for what we want to achieve, and that's something fundamental that needs to change in our own mindset. And you're right, start thinking like humans instead of the selfish beings that we've been for quite a long time, unfortunately. Just sort of in closing, because I'm aware that I don't want to take too much more of your time, but who would you, in your mind at the moment, who do you think are the key players that we need to be supporting in what they're doing in this sort of, I guess, future generation support and looking forward?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose at a very global level, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced just over a year ago that he wants to have a UN Declaration for Future Generations, which I suppose would be almost like the UN equivalent of a Welsh Future Generations Act, and also the appointment of a UN Special Envoy for Future Generations, which is quite exciting. But I think that there are also these moves in countries across the world now. In New Zealand, have a wellbeing budget. I'm not sure how well that has kind of filtered down out of government and into other organisations, but you have a starter there which you could actually build on by saying, OK, we're going to set as a nation what are the things that we think are important to our wellbeing, and we're going to drive towards those outcomes in every decision that we take, the way in which we interact with the private sector, the way in which we regulate, the way in which we spend our money. Public policy should be designed to do those things, and we should be applying a future generations lens to that. And I spent a few weeks in New Zealand with various different organisations a couple of months ago talking about some of these issues, and I think there's quite an appetite there. Similarly, across the way in Australia, the Federal Treasurer there has announced his first wellbeing budget, and it has a way to go in terms of how that is actually influencing policy rather than just measuring outcomes. But there's stuff that you can take there. Here in the UK, Wales is the first to legislate. Scotland, the Scottish Parliament is just about to pass future generations legislation. And there's some really interesting work that's been going on in Canada on wellbeing metrics and indicators, in Iceland, in Finland. There's some really interesting stuff going on there. So I think that there's something around every country demanding of their governments how they are prioritising people and planet over supporting profit and facilitating a world which just encourages profit. And I think that there are lessons from across the world that can be applied in different circumstances in different countries if we choose to take them.
I think you're right. I mean, there is enough information around. I mean, that's one thing we've got lots of, is information about what's not worked, and also about what does work. We need to start using that data appropriately, I think, don't we? That it's one of the things that. That's all right. Well, at least a good alarm system you've got there. Is there anything else that you think that you'd like to share about what you've been doing and what you're looking to do in the future that we can include in the podcast?
Well, I am now working with sorry about the dogs.
That's right.
I am now working with a range of different governments at all levels across the world, some quite unusual countries as well. You wouldn't necessarily think would be thinking about these things, to work out, what are the opportunities in those countries to start embedding some of those thinkings. I'm also working with some really progressive corporates who are trying to move beyond beyond ESG, so beyond just the kind of reporting and the metrics and this is how we're doing this in a linear way against the sustainable development goals, but not really changing the culture of their organizations, not looking at the interconnections between different things. And I think that's the way that things need to go. So I guess if you're in that space, if you're a private sector organization or a local government institution or whatever you might be, and you want to talk about how you might be able to do something similar, then please do get in touch.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sophie. It's been fantastic talking to you. Thank you for taking the time. I'm really enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot, so it's really good for me. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. Well,
I'll speak to you soon. Thank
care.
you. You too.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to my podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts, on sustainability. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like, share and follow for more episodes. Thank you.